Strange Shadows, a Carcash and Smith podcast.
I have no reason to expect that anyone will believe my story. If it were another's tale, probably I should not feel inclined to give it credence myself. I tell it herewith, hoping that the mere act of narration, the mere shaping of this macabre daymare adventure into words, will in some slight measure serve to relieve my mind of its execrable burden. There have been times when only a hair's breadth has intervened betwixt myself and the seething, devil-ridden world of madness. For the hideous knowledge, the horror-blackened memories which I have carried so long were never meant to be borne by the human intellect. A singular confession, no doubt, for one who has always been a connoisseur of horrors. The deadly, the malign, and baleful things that lurk in the labyrinth of existence have held for me a fascination no less potent than unholy.
Greetings and welcome to Season 2, Episode 5 of Strange Shadows, the Clark Ashton Smith podcast. The voice you heard there leading us in was Mr. Gavin Chappell reading an excerpt of the first story. I'm one of your hosts, Tim Mendes.
And I'm the other one, Rob Pint. Yes, we're covering two short stories today, but before we get into those, I just wanted to mention something. Strange Shadows and the Innsmouth Book Club are now available on a wide range of podcast platforms, including Apple and lots of other things that I've never even heard of, Stitcher and Spotter and Splatter and Sputter. Because as regular listeners will know, Tim and I, when it comes to modern tech, we're in about 1985, aren't we? But anyway,
pretty much.
Yeah. The show is available on a lot of those platforms, and apparently you can also leave reviews. So we would appreciate any reviews that you leave, because that will really help us to expand the show. And I also just want to quickly mention as well that you can subscribe to us on Buzzsprout as well now. Basically, as well as signing up on Patreon, you can also get a Tier 1 membership on Buzzsprout. That gets you access to bonus episodes of Strange Shadows and the Innsmouth Book Club, as well as a copy of Innsmouth News newsletter and free entry to our events, such as the Innsmouth Literary Festival. So, that's that out of the way. What are we reading today, Tim?
Well, yeah, we're going to be looking at two stories. We're going to be looking at, they're both about 10 pages each, I think. We're going to be looking at The Gorgon, and we're also going to be looking at An Offering to the Moon. Two stories that I haven't read either of, to be honest. And yeah, good stuff.
Yeah, I don't think I'd read these ones before either. And yeah, as you say, very good stories. So,
Definitely.
Shall we start with our favourite words then? I have to say, I couldn't find too many in these, or at least words that I didn't recognise. But I've put a couple in where I knew the words, or I knew the meaning of the words, but just like the sound of it.
Yeah, same. Yeah, the first one I found is specifically one of those that I've heard before, but I just love it, which is catafelque. Which is the raised beer or box used to transport coffins. Typical goth. I'm always going to gravitate towards words like that.
Well, keeping in that sort of goth, dressy uppy theme, the first one I spotted that I liked the sound of was fabulosity.
Oh, fabulosity. That's a good one.
That's a characteristic that everyone should have, a certain level of fabulosity, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah, the next ones, they were all from that one was from the first story. These are from the second. We've got oblations, which is something offered to God.
And I'm going to go with a Greek word from the first one. Obviously, that has a very Greek theme to it.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how to pronounce this correctly. Laocoon, Laocoon, who apparently was a Trojan priest whose family was attacked by serpents. And I think there's rather a famous statue of this chap hacking away at several serpents.
Nice.
An action statue.
That's brilliant. Yeah, the next one for me is luctations. which is the struggle to overcome or endure.
Very nice. And I'm going to follow that with plenilune, which
Hey,
simply means a full moon. Plenilune.
I love that word. It's like
Nice, isn't it?
plenilune. Yeah, that's a good one. It's also, I found out, it's also a type of shrub native to New Zealand.
Oh, right.
Yeah, there
Double
you go.
meaning.
Yeah, and the final one I got, I'm going to make an absolute mess of this. Inenerable. I'm going to go with inenerable. It's basically means unspeakable.
Quite appropriate.
Yeah. Or more specifically, unable to be narrated.
Ah, okay.
Yeah,
Unutterable. Wow.
Unutterable, yes.
And I'm going to finish with veridical, which simply means truthful, but that was a word I was unfamiliar with.
Nice.
Okay, so let's get into our first story, the Gorgon. And what have we got for the publication history?
Right, well, the Gorgon was originally called Medusa. Clark Asher Smith completed it on October the 2nd, 1930. And he subbed it to Weird Tales, and surprise, surprise, it was rejected as being unconvincing.
Unconvincing.
Yeah,
How
strange.
strange, yeah.
Yeah. He then sent it to Ghost Tales, where the editor liked it and held it for 6 weeks for consideration, but it eventually got rejected because he just couldn't make it fit, basically. But he liked the story. We had that before from that guy. That editor obviously likes Smith, but it doesn't really fit Ghost Tales, you know?
Yeah, I guess to be fair, they're sort of weird tales, not particularly, not ghosty as such, are they?
Exactly.
Yeah.
He then sent it to Strange Tales, where it was again rejected. But oddly, 1 year later, Farnsworth Wright accepted it.
Which is a recurring thing with Wright.
Yeah, but he hasn't changed it. It wasn't revised in any way. Clark Asher Smith had resubbed it. August Derleth pointed out that there'd recently been in Weird Tales another story called Medusa in a recent issue. So he basically told Smith, and Smith changed it. He first changed it to Medusa's Head before settling it on the Gorgon. It was then published in the April 1932 issue of Weird Tales.
It does seem an odd thing with Wright, and I wonder if this was it a sign of Smith's growing popularity in Weird Tales that earlier stories get rejected, but as we go on, they get accepted or reaccepted.
Possibly, yeah, very possibly. I wonder if it's also changing fashions, because we speculated about this a while ago, didn't we? It may have been the last.
Yeah, we did with Gavin. Yeah, fashions or trends in Weird Tales.
Yeah, I wonder if that has any bearing on it, because you know, if your more fantastical stories are in vogue a couple of years down the line, then he's more likely to take it, isn't he?
Yeah, yeah. And you know, Wright was running a commercial magazine, right? This wasn't. This was a professional publication, not a hobby sort of thing. So I don't know. I suppose it's easy to look back now and say it, but wouldn't you just publish everything that Clark Ashton Smith sent into you, including his letters?
Well, this is it. But we've got the benefit of hindsight, haven't we? I mean, at the time, because especially as Smith was mainly known for poetry. Yeah. So I guess, I don't know. I don't know how big his following would have been.
Yeah. Well, Uncle Howard certainly pushed him and promoted him.
Yeah. Yeah. Him and Derleth both. It was, yeah.
Well, we heard the first paragraph of the story there read by Gavin, but the story actually opens with a couple of lines from Shelley. Yet it is less the horror than the grace which turns the gazer's spirit into stone. Shelley, of course, had some connections with Greece, where he was a big supporter of Greek independence. He wrote a poem called Hellas, for example, and he saw Greek culture very much as the bedrock of European culture. I think he once said, "We are all Greek," in reference to our cultural roots.
Yeah.
So it's a nice connection there, because obviously the Gorgon, the Medusa, we're in Greek mythological territory.
Yeah, definitely.
And this is a nice opening to a weird story. Well, no one's going to believe this, and to be honest, I wouldn't believe it myself.
I'd love to know who first did that, because you get it a lot, especially when you look at the really old sort of Cthulhu mythos anthologies.
Yeah,
you do see it quite a few times throughout the thing. I wonder who was the first person to go. Probably
Yeah.
somebody like James, wasn't it? I'd imagine, or
It could be, and I'm getting a line or a quote from somewhere which will scarce be believed, but I can't think of where that comes from. I can almost see it as the title of a story or the narration of something or other which will scarce be believed. But if any listeners out there recognise that, then do let me know. And we learn that our protagonist is a connoisseur of horrors, the deadly, the malign, and baleful things that lurk in the labyrinth of existence have held for me a fascination no less potent than unholy. The labyrinth of existence. There you go.
Oh,
Album or band? I think maybe an album name.
both. I could go with either on that. Yeah.
But interestingly enough, and quite in keeping with the characters of Lovecraft and co., although this person has a fascination with the malign, the baleful, he views them almost with sort of scientific detachment. Almost, he describes himself having the approach of a savant who handles corrosive poisons in his laboratory with mask and gloves. Never did they have for me the least hint of personal menace, since I viewed them with the most impersonal detachment. And it sort of sounds like he investigates this stuff and he's into it, but he doesn't really believe any of it.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, it's that trope, isn't it? The collector of the unusual. They collect it because it's unusual, not because it has any significance to them. You get a lot of that, don't you? These occult collectors and things like that. You collect these weird, wonderful objects and artifacts, but they don't actually believe in the supernatural.
Yeah, it does seem to tie in with that character of Lovecraft who, although he enjoyed Poe and he wrote these stories of the macabre, well, we can argue about how much supernatural is in them. Nonetheless, he was a complete materialist. And I think Smith as well, to some extent. I think maybe a little less so. But I don't think Smith was a believer in werewolves and vampires and ghosts and stuff.
No, I think I like the term saying about the supernatural for Lovecraft is wrong. I like the Hope Hodgson term that Carnacki uses, abnatural.
Oh, abnatural, that's good.
Abnatural.
Yeah.
I like that. It's a Carnacki term.
Yeah. Abnatural. And we learn that our setting, where he has this experience that sort of shifts his worldview a little bit, takes place in 20th century London.
Yeah.
Somewhere we're both familiar with.
Indeed. Very much so. Yeah.
And we learn really that he's on his travels in order to find some sort of, peace of mind or even oblivion following the death of his wife.
Yeah.
And he thinks he's going to be able to sort of lose himself, I suppose, in the hustle and bustle of London.
Yeah, he mentions here, I have continual need of modern crowds, of glaring lights, of laughter and clangor and tumult to reassure me. And always I'm afraid that such things are only an insubstantial barrier, that behind them lies the realm of ancient horror and immemorial malignity, of which I have had this one abominable glimpse. So yeah, it's like he's gone there to escape from his grief, but it's just a facade.
Yeah. And it's this very nice idea again of, London is a very old city, as we know, of the everyday hustle and bustle hides this deeper reality.
Absolutely. Yeah. The seedy underbelly. It's funny when you're in the centre of London and you take the wrong turn down an alleyway, and all of a sudden it's like you're in a completely different place.
Absolutely. And I was going to mention this because this is pretty much what happens to him, right? He has this singular encounter with an old man who we'll describe in a minute. But he basically then follows this guy. And it is that in London, you can be in sort of Holborn or something like that, busy main road, a little turn, and suddenly you're in like a medieval courtyard.
Yes.
Or, a Georgian square or something like that. And it can be incredibly quiet and peaceful. So London does retain a lot of that old history. And I think what is added into this, of course, because being of the time that it was, you've got the good old London fog as well.
Oh, of course, the old pea super. Yeah, because it was before the Clean Air Act and all that business, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and I was thinking as well because, well, if he's setting it in contemporary times for him, that would have been 1920s, 1930s.
Yeah,
So that was London pre-Blitz as well.
indeed.
And
Yeah.
of course, the Blitz destroyed a huge amount of old churches and buildings. And then once you get into the 50s and 60s, a lot of that is modernized.
Yeah.
But back in those days, you probably still had even the ratteries and those sort of things were
Yeah,
probably still in existence from Dickens' time.
yeah. Well, I guess it's the same London that P.G. Wodehouse wrote about because it was that was set contemporary around the same sort of time. So it was basically he's walking around Bertie Wooster's London. It's the same sort of thing. It's all these hotels and churches and all the rest of it.
Yeah. And then you come off of that and you go down Seven Dials, and it's sorry, it should be rookeries, not ratteries.
Rookeries, yeah.
Was, again, a lot of those are still in existence at this time, I imagine.
Yeah. And the Isle of Dogs and all that.
Oh, don't. And this old man, it's very interesting the way he encounters him because he's just strolling down this busy street and we get this. Among the faint recollections of that period, it is etched as with some black acid. I cannot recall the name of the street on which I saw him, but it was not far from the Strand and was full of a late afternoon crowd beneath a heaven of high fog through which the sun had not penetrated for days or weeks. So we've got that busyness going on, that urban hustle and bustle, but the fog kind of gives it already a little bit of a different atmosphere.
Yeah. I mean that's quintessentially London, isn't it? Like
Yes.
Just a period, the London fog, the pea super,
Yeah.
a London particular, as it was known. Yeah. Although I said that in a posh accent, when it wouldn't have been in a posh accent at all, would it?
London particular.
Yeah, that's it.
What a good time, dearie. You can tell I've said that before.
Halfpenny Knee Trembler. Yeah.
There's a good band name, the Halfpenny Knee Tremblers.
It is, isn't it? Yeah.
And this guy, you get the feeling he sort of steps out of the crowd almost in front of him. And I almost picture everything around him comes to a stop or sort of fades into insignificance. It's so focused on this guy. With the mortal pallor of his deeply wrinkled features like graven ivory, with his long curling hair and beard that were white as moon-touched vapour. Isn't that a lovely description?
Isn't it?
With his eyes that glowed in their hollow sockets like the coals of demon fires in underworld caverns. He would have made a living model for Charon, the boatman who ferries the dead to Hades across the ebon silence of the Styx. So this is like a guy who stepped out of a sort of a book on Greek mythology or something. It's not specific about the clothing, but it looks antique.
Yeah. I also got sort of Dickensian echoes from it. But I guess you got them same sort of characters, didn't you? These guys are almost like figures out of time, your Fagins and all that kind of business,
And it's in other circumstances and situations, we could go full Nookie-Nomicon on this, really, because
yeah, we could.
This is almost like the case for the defence, isn't it? I was walking along a London street when this gentleman approached me and said, "Here, do you want to see something horrible?"
Yeah, exactly.
And led him down an alleyway.
In his long, dirty Mac.
His long, dirty Mac.
You want to see some photos? Yeah.
But this guy is quite straight up front about this. I can see that you have a taste for horror, the dark and awful secrets of death, the equally dreadful mysteries of life allure your interest. If you care to come with me, I will show you something which is the quintessence of all horror. You shall gaze on the head of Medusa, which is quite a big claim to make, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
And even the words are strange. He thinks the guy is speaking English, but it could also be Greek as well. Again, is this as much a sort of psychic communication as it is verbal?
Yeah, it's strange because you get that feeling again that it's almost like liminal spaces again, isn't it? You know, he's gone down this alley and then is he hearing Greek? Is he hearing English? Blah, blah, blah. But again, this comes back later on, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah. And I thought the liminal space idea as well, because as he follows this guy, it is almost into this other side of London that we've spoken about, with the fog and the strange alleys and the little courtyards and everything else. And it put me in mind of Malnéon as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Which was the same theme of grief for a lost loved one. And again, are you actually really in a city, or have you gone somewhere else now?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It's a recurrent theme in a lot of Smith's work, isn't it? That sort of, I mean, you got it in the last story, Rendezvous in Averoigne, where he crosses over a certain point of the forest and there's this castle. Well, is it there? Is it not? You know?
Yeah. So he follows this guy to a dilapidated mansion, which belonged to a period which I was unable to name, despite my extensive architectural knowledge. It stood a little apart from the surrounding tenements, and more than the dimness of the premature twilight seemed to adhere to its dark walls and lampless windows. It impressed me with a sense of vastness, yet I've never been quite sure concerning its exact dimensions. So it's quite sort of dreamlike as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
And again, Smith, as he does, one thing he's a master of is creating this very particular atmosphere.
Yeah.
And the whole inside of the house, the interior, is just as ancient, as strange as the outside. We've got a long hall with silver lamps. We've got ancient tapestries and vases and a mosaic floor. And these lamps burn with a white flame that were preternaturally still and cold. I'm not sure. Is that a specific reference to anything in Greek myth? I'm not really too sure.
No, I'm not. I'm not sure. But it sounds like it could be, couldn't it? Because I thought that they had always burned in this manner, unflickering, unreplenished, throughout a frozen eternity whose days were in no wise different from its nights. It does sound like a reference, doesn't it?
Yeah, like an eternal flame. I suppose you have the Olympic flame. Is it something like that, maybe?
The Bangles. Said eternal flame. That's where my brain went straight away.
Oh, that's good. At least it wasn't Coldplay or something.
Oh, God.
And he sort of finds himself a little bit and starts asking questions. And he says, I'm naturally surprised to learn that the Gorgon's head has survived into modern times. Unless the query is impertinent, will you not tell me how it came into your possession? Which, you know, it's not an unreasonable question to ask.
Yeah, I love this now. He laughed the old man with a loathsome rictus. Loathsome Rictus is another great band name.
That is.
Yeah. That is easily answered. I won the head from Perseus at a game of dice when he was in his dotage.
Absolutely love this, because I thought this is real typical sword and sorcery hero stuff, isn't it? It's like Conan would get the treasure from the Tower of the Elephant, but then lose it all the next night gambling in some seedy den, you know. Here we have Perseus, one of the leading heroes of the age, but he loses this amazing...
Started gambling, yeah.
Probably had a few goblets of wine too many, and, you know. Yeah. Well, he's in his dotage as well. Perhaps he's hard up, you know.
Yeah. Well, it happens, doesn't it? You know.
Cohen the Barbarian, isn't it? And we get our sense of the cosmic here, or at least in terms of time, because obviously it says Perseus lived several thousand years ago. And the old man says, yes, according to your notation, but time is not altogether the simple matter which you believe it to be. There are shortcuts between the ages. There are deviations and overlappings among the epochs of which you have no idea. So, as we said, he might be in London, but we're not sure what time frame he's in.
Yeah, that's that classic liminal space thing, isn't it? You know, it goes back to the Lovecraftian thing of the walls being thin in certain areas, certain places.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
The barriers in realities.
Yeah, and whether that's into a different time or a different dimension or a different space, then you know, these places exist.
Yeah, I like the idea of ancient Greece being a place out of time. You know, sort of off to the side kind of thing. It's got its own little pocket. I kind of like that idea. It's an interesting thought.
And yeah, because you think places like Hades and that sort of stuff, although they were physically the underworld, there was also very much in those, right, you cross the river, right?
Yeah.
You've got
Yeah.
that step again. You have to go across something or through something. That's the threshold. And then you're in this place that is kind of this world, but a little bit, like you say, off to one side of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which then you think, can you apply that to all the world mythologies? They all exist on some
Indeed,
level,
yeah.
you know.
Yeah, this is it. I mean, a lot of it. I mean, it's like, crossing the Rainbow Bridge and all that kind of stuff. It's all.
Yeah.
There's always a crossing or a passage through, isn't there?
Yeah. And now, of course, because we're in Gorgon or Medusa territory, one thing we certainly need is a mirror. And the old man, luckily, he's got one to hand.
Yeah, and what a mirror it is as well. It's the sort of mirror I really want in my in my hallway. You know.
This reminded me of one of those sort of Hammer or Amicus films.
Yeah.
I think where's the one where the guy buys the haunted mirror from the antique store? Wasn't there a vampire trapped in the mirror or something like that? There's been a couple of that kind of thing.
Yes, that has.
Ian Ogilvy springs to mind for some reason, but I'm not sure. Well, that
I
might
have
have
to dig
been.
out my Hammer box set in a bit. I'm sure it's in there somewhere.
Yeah, that might have been a door. There was definitely one with the vampire in the mirror. And it does sound like one of those type of mirrors, doesn't it? The face was highly polished with a reflecting surface well nigh equal to that of glass, but the back and handle, with their strange carvings of Laocoon-like figures that writhed in a nameless frozen agony, were black with the tarnish of elder centuries. It might well have been the very mirror that was employed by Perseus.
I always thought it was a polished shield.
Yeah, I thought we looked into the shield from what I remember, but maybe there's some different versions of that around.
Possibly.
I can't help thinking with mirrors of things like John Dee's Scrying Glass and the Mirror of Nitocris and all that kind of stuff as well.
Yes, the Mirror of Nitocris, yeah. It's a great story by Brian Lumley, actually.
Yeah, we should cover that sometime. Yeah.
It's one of his Titus Crow stories.
And there's this little peep, isn't there? As he's being taken into the Medusa room, there's a little peep through the doorway of this room that seems to be full of statues.
I love it. Some of them standing erect in postures of painful rigor, others lying on the floor in agonized eternal contortions. Yeah, absolutely brilliant. Just them. That one line tells you everything you need to know, don't you? You can just picture them, these guys, like reaching out.
That sort of frozen fear, yeah, and the contorted features and the writhing limbs sort of locked into immobility, yeah. And the old man was at my elbow, leering and peering into my face with a demoniac malice. "You are admiring my collection of statuary," he said, "and I can see that you are impressed by its realism, but perhaps you have already guessed that the statues are identical with their models." And of course, as we know, these are the people who weren't content with just looking in the mirror. They had to gaze upon Medusa.
I've just realised that, like I say, this is the first time I'd read this was this morning, but this bit is kind of reminiscent of a story I wrote years ago about a model, the model village, the British model villages.
Oh, yeah.
And the little figures in it. Because I'd seen one as a kid, and it was weathered, and the paint had run, and it made it look like this guy was screaming.
Nice.
So I did a story where people were being stuck in these model villages by this creepy old guy who owned this old Victorian miniature park, right? And I've just realised it's like, all right, okay, they're very similar there. But again, I just want to point out I've only just read this story.
No plagiarism here.
Yeah.
That's a nice image, though. I like that. I want to read that now.
Yeah. Plug time. It's in my second collection, Visions and Abomination.
And of course, we get this. I suppose it's a big sort of trope now for horror, or certainly with the Medusa, but with other sort of beings or entities as well. This idea of death and beauty in one package. You know, that's like either like the succubus or the vampire or whatever. There's this appeal. There's this seduction. And with the Medusa, she's so beautiful, you just have to look at her directly, which, of course, spells doom.
Yeah, with a capital D.
Big stone D. So there's a strange altar in the room, draped with some funereal black fabric, and lamps were burning on each side with their tall and frozen flames. In the centre, On a broad pattern of silver or electrum, there stood the veritable head, even as the ancient myths have depicted it, with vipers crawling and lifting among its matted locks. So that's what he sees in the mirror.
Yeah.
Which is kind of attractive enough in a strange way. Has an unspeakably radiant pallor, a dead face from which there poured the luminous, blinding glory of celestial corruption.
Brilliant use of language again. Superhuman bale and suffering.
She was lovely. She was dreadful beyond any vision ever vouchsafed to a mystic or an artist. And the light that emanated from her features was the light of worlds that lie too deep or too high for mortal perception. So there's this very strong yearning to actually gaze upon her properly.
Yeah. And that's when the old man goes into full-on Lucifer mode, doesn't he? Full-on temptation mode here. It's brilliantly creepy because he's there, he's looking in the mirror, and then all of a sudden at his shoulder, almost like the devil appearing on it, he's like, "Is she not beautiful?" he whispered. "Could you not gaze upon her forever? And do you not long to behold her without the intermediation of the mirror, which hardly does her justice?" It's like, ooh, creepy old guy.
But he resists. I admit all you say, but I will not gaze any longer, and I'm not mad enough to let myself be turned to a stone image. And he pushes the mirror back into the old man's hands and goes to leave. The mirror clatters to the floor as the old man springs upon him with a tigerish agility. So this guy looks quite old and decrepit, but is quite a powerful physical specimen. And now we've gone beyond any seduction. He's actually going to try and force him to look upon the Medusa.
Yeah, this struck me. It's one of the most action-packed sequences we've seen in Smith, specifically this kind of story. But it's an incredibly brutal fight. He's there, and they're having a scuffle, and the old man shifts his weight and starts trying to force his eyelids up with his thumbs.
I thought I got a really visual sense of this. I can really picture this as a scene where they're doing that kind of wrestling and struggling away, and you get the man's hand creeping up the guy's face really slow to try and, like you say, prise his eyelids open. So yeah, very visual.
I thought that with this whole story, I thought this would make a great episode of Night Gallery or something along them lines, one of those anthology shows. If you're listening, Guillermo del Toro, do it, but don't muck about with it.
Yeah, we want a proper one this time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because, of course, our protagonist has his eyes shut while he's doing this struggling, and he's sort of getting the worst of it. He's bent back. It feels like his neck's going to break. They're in a narrow space. He's pushed back into a row of stone figures, some of which were recumbent on the floor. But then I like the idea that these statues actually proves the undoing of the old man, because during this struggle, our protagonist goes back and he falls over one of these statues, and the old man sort of goes with him and falls with a wild, despairing cry. And as they fall, the old man releases him, hits the floor with a big crash, and then there's silence.
Yeah, I like that. It's a great image, isn't it? He's obviously hit the floor going, oh!
As you do.
But he's got a really funny look on his face now.
So he kind of half opens his lids and he sees the old man lying at his feet, and he can see straight away, he's gone. He's rigid. Smitten instantaneously into an image of dark stone. In falling, he had seen the very face of Medusa, even as his victims had seen it. And now he would lie among them forever. And that's pretty much it. He gets out of there. Yeah. I think it's interesting. He has no curiosity in the house or what else might be in it. I mean, if this guy's got Medusa's head, you wonder, has he got other stuff as well? Or is it just one particular thing,
You could do a really good follow-up if he found Pandora's box or something,
Yeah. So he flees from the house, and then I think this is what sort of gives it away in a sense. I fled from the room. I found my way from that horrible mansion. I sought to lose it from sight and memory in half-deserted, mysterious alleys that were no legitimate part of London. So we know those places, certainly if we go back to Dickens, they were where all, the havens of criminality and everything else. Well,
Oh yeah,
even Whitechapel into the 20th
Whitechapel,
century would have,
Spitalfields, all them kind of places.
yeah. But at the same time, there's that, is it legitimate in terms or not legitimate in terms of not actually being in modern London? It's a separate space.
Yeah. It's interesting because I mean there is all these kind of hidden places. I've actually got a book called Hidden London.
Mm.
It's all like the old sidings of the Necropolis Railway and all this kind of
Oh,
stuff.
yeah.
It's all this stuff that you'll have walked past hundreds of times if you spent any time in London, but only it's literally just there, just out of sight.
Yeah, your disused tube stations,
Exactly.
Museum Street or whatever it was
The
called.
rivers and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the hidden rivers. There's a guy on YouTube does very good walks. I think his name is John, might be Williams or something. I'll put a link up to his YouTube channel. He does a lot of walks around London, and he does exactly that. He traces the River Fleet and all the old
nice.
rivers and all that kind of thing.
Oh, I'd really be interested in that because I'm writing quite a lot of London-based Victoriana at the minute. So,
yeah. Very good, very interesting stuff. And that's it. He eventually finds himself somehow in a familiar street where people thronged in the lamplit dusk, and the air was no longer chill except with a falling fog. So he's back to reality.
Nice.
So yeah, very effective story, I think. And
yeah, I really liked it. I'm surprised I've never read it before, but I don't know how much it's been reprinted, to be honest. But it's a really good one.
I think maybe because it falls out of his settings or his genres of the Hyperborea or Zothique or whatever.
Or even Auburn is, because most of his contemporary stuff is set in Auburn, isn't it?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I think this is the first one that has been in London, perhaps. Yeah. Certainly, we weren't quite sure where Malneol was, but we had a sense of it being in France, I guess.
Yeah, going off the name, I mean, because most people tie that in with his Averoigne stories anyway, so.
Of course, yeah. All right, so that brings us to our next story, An Offering to the Moon. And I'm going to take a wild guess here and say that Farnsworth Wright rejected it.
Ding, 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 we have a winner. Yeah. Indeed, yeah. It was completed around October the 21st, 1930, and Smith submitted it to Weird Tales, and Wright rejected it. He rejected it, calling it wordy and somehow, I do not know why, unconvincing, though that is a splendid paragraph on page 14 describing the death of Morley on the altar. Part of what follows seems anticlimax. Smith replied to Lovecraft. He was talking about it. He says, I suspect too that An Offering to the Moon was doubtless queered with him by the addition of an element which was far from weird. That is to say, the full development of the stodgy Thorway as a foil to Morley. Of course, the action was held up by the archaeological discussion, which brought out this difference. Smith then submitted it to Ghost Stories and Philippine magazine, which he'd been in before, if you recall, before resubmitting it to Weird Tales, where it was again rejected by Farnsworth Wright. This time, Farnsworth Wright said, "It's not a bad story. In fact, I don't think you have ever sent me a truly bad story, but it seems far from being your best work." So from there, the story gathered dust until 1950, when Smith sent 3 unpublished stories to August Derleth for possible use in an anthology. Offering to the Moon was eventually accepted by Wright's successor, Dorothy McIlworth, and appeared in the September 1953 issue of Weird Tales. So think about that. 1930 to 1953, 23 years.
23 years. That's a long time to wait for a check, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah, well, that brings me to the next point. Unfortunately, as of October 1954, when the magazine was declared bankrupt, Smith hadn't been paid.
Oh, my word.
It is believed that he never received payment for the story. So, yeah, it's a bit of a shame, really, isn't it? And, you wait all that time, you wait 23 years to get published. And the magazine you've got published in for goes under.
It goes under, so you don't even get paid after all
Yeah.
that time. And again, I think, this isn't Smith. It's not one of his great stories, but it's a solid enough story. And I'm sure it's head and shoulders above most of the stuff that Wright was getting or even printing at the time.
Well, interestingly, that's exactly what August Derleth said in a letter.
Yeah.
Was basically the same, because, I've mentioned several times they critique each issue of Weird Tales. And obviously he'd read that and he went, well, it's better than any of the crap that was in the last issue. So,
and it probably was,
Yeah.
Unconvincing. That's a strange one, isn't it? Unconvincing.
He said it about the Gorgon as well. It's
I'm not sure what is unconvincing about it, given that you're dealing with weird, supernatural, mythological, science fiction,
strange, isn't it?
Yeah. This is the other side of Wright saying things are too weird for Weird Tales. These are not weird enough, or I don't know.
Yeah. It's a hard one. It's a hard one to fathom, isn't it?
I suppose there is side of it. We both edit stuff, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes you want to be nice in a rejection letter,
Indeed.
Maybe there's an element of that going on. I don't know. That's just pure speculation.
Yeah.
And I will say to anyone, if you are thinking of putting anything through to a call for an anthology or a book or a collection or anything else, then the single best thing you can do to make sure your story gets read is format it properly.
Yeah, read the guidelines.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I'll just leave that there.
Yeah. I mean, I've cocked up on that one before where I've not read the guidelines properly. And I've sent something in and they were like, you didn't read the brief, did you? Nope.
Your story doesn't even get read then, believe me.
Yeah.
So we opened with an announcement by a chap called Morley. I believe that the roofless temples of Mu were not all devoted to solar worship, but that many of them were consecrated to the moon. And I'm sure that the one we have now discovered proves my point. These hieroglyphics are lunar symbols beyond a doubt. So we're in the company of archaeologists. We have Morley and his fellow archaeologist, Thorway. One thing that struck me here is Thorway looked at Morley after this announcement, and he was struck anew by the singularity of Morley's tones and expression. Thorway himself is not incapable of enthusiasm when the occasion seems to warrant it, but Morley seems possessed of this well-nigh religious ardour, which put me in mind of some earlier characters like is it Captain Volmar?
Captain Volmar, yeah.
There's this kind of, like you said before, this sort of monomania, this obsession that goes beyond just scientific interest.
Well, interestingly, don't we get the cropping up of one of my old favourite words, sacerdotal, don't we? Yeah. Later on. This is almost like a religious fervour. Yeah.
And I like this phrase, talk about understatement. He wondered, not for the first time, if his companion's mentality were not a trifle eccentric. But then again, that's such a trope, isn't it? The archaeologist or the explorer, the eccentric Victorian type.
Indeed. In tweed.
In tweed. Pith helmet and tweed. Yeah.
Yeah. And a belly full of gin, probably, as well. Yeah.
Thorway has to put up with this because he's employed by Morley, who's basically funded this entire expedition.
Yeah.
And, it sounds like Thorway's on a good gig here, right? So he doesn't want to rock the boat too much. And they've been making their way around the Melanesian Isles. So we've got Easter Island. We've got the truncated pyramidal columns of the Ladrones. They'd visited all the far-strewn remains which are held to prove the former existence of a great continent in the mid-Pacific. So that idea of Mu sort of fits in with that theory, doesn't it? Mu being it was another sort of type of Atlantis civilization.
Yes.
Sank.
Yeah, mid-Pacific. Yeah. They get this. It's basically an old temple, isn't it? It's surrounded by a tangle of palms, jackfruit, various tropical shrubs. And there's like a center was a huge square block rising 4 feet above the ground level, which might well have served as an altar. It was carved with rude symbols, which appeared to represent the moon in all its digits, and was curiously grooved across the top from middle to one side, with a trough that became deeper towards the edge. Like all buildings of the sort, it was plain that the temple had never supported a roof. Now you get that hint, don't you, there? Sacrifice and dark rites and all the
Yes.
rest.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, if it's a temple to the moon or the sun, then it makes no sense to have a roof, does it? So also
Yeah.
it would be open. Like I guess of the Stonehenge and those places that, well, I don't know what the current scientific thought is on that. The solar temples, lunar temples,
Well,
whatever.
this is it, isn't it?
That certainly seems to be a major consideration.
Yeah. And this is where we get that that was one of my words from earlier. As Morley went on, I believe that rites of human sacrifice were performed in these temples. Oblations of blood were poured not only to the sun, but to the moon. So, yeah, it's obviously quite a lot of stuff has gone on here, and it's no wonder it's shunned by the local populace.
Yeah. And did you notice as well that thing that although there's all this vegetation growing around it, none grows within the walls as well? So that's a nice, subtle little touch.
Again, it's that Smith thing of like lush and verdant giving away to decay and ruination.
And it's always very nonplussed by all of this. The idea is maintainable, of course. Morley did not perceive the dryness and formality of his confrere's ascent. He was preoccupied with feelings and ideas, some of which could hardly have been the natural result of his investigations. And we get this description of him being in all of his investigations of ancient remains, he's troubled by a nervous agitation, a compound of irresoluble awe and terror, of nameless eager fascination and expectancy, and he's getting that feeling even stronger here. So we've got two archaeologists, scientists. One, as we said, is as Smith describes him, very sort of straight and stodgy almost, and the other guy is going like, "Wow, oh, look at that! Oh, look at this! I bet this was."
It's like it reminds me when I take the missus round these like haunted locations and weird places of folklore.
That's where they filmed episode 6 of UFO in 19.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. This is it, isn't it? Very good, dear. Yeah.
But this feeling, this is going beyond any sort of natural excitement or even this, as you said, quasi-religious fervour. We're getting into territory here of it awakening some sort of memory.
Yeah.
And again, this is something we see a lot in Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard and Smith. This idea is either reincarnation or a sort of ancestral memory that comes down your family line for good or for bad, usually for bad. And yeah, this is where what I've written here is this is where Morley starts tripping out because he's actually, apparently hallucinating now. It seemed to him that the narrow shadows wrought by a meridian sun were peopled with unseen faces. More than once he was prompted to rub his eyes, for ghostly films of colour, like flashes of yellow and purple garments, came and went in the most infinitesimal fraction of time. Though the air was utterly still, he had the sense of perpetual movement all around him, of the passing to and fro of intangible throngs. It was many thousand years in all likelihood since human feet had trodden these pavements, but Morley could have cried aloud with the imminence of the long dead ages. So it's almost this process of his going back in time, or at least he's having a vision of times past.
Again, that's something that Smith uses quite a lot, isn't it? It's almost like dream walking, almost, isn't it? Spirit walking.
Yeah, it's like a waking trance, isn't it? Is having a dream vision, but in the waking mode.
Yeah, well, I wonder if it's even deeper than that. If it's more like astral projection.
Yeah. Well, you think we had the guy in the last story travel to this other time in a way.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of similar theme, but in very different setting and a slightly different tone as well. You get the impression perhaps that Morley in some former incarnation was actually there. He has a connection to this.
Yeah. Which brings to mind Belknap Long's Hounds of Tinderloss, right? It's like all time is connected and it's all happening at once kind of thing. And
And he starts describing all this. He describes these people and what they're doing and the blood sacrifice that is going on and the blood is caught in goblets as it runs from the altar. And Thorway is sort of, right, okay, yeah, and you know this because...
Yeah. Yeah, I love this. They were a joyous and childlike race, those people of Mu. Like, joyous.
Yeah,
Sacrifice and blood. Yeah.
yeah, that sounds joyous as long as it's not you on the altar.
Yeah, I suppose, yeah.
And Morley just says, well, I just know, I have seen. And he sort of freezes for a moment, then he comes out with this strange phrase, Ralu Muvasa Fan, in a monotonous hieratic tone, like a sort of invocation. I love his friend's response here. Are you ill? The sun's pretty hot today and one should be careful. Perhaps we'd best return to the schooner. That's such an English thing, isn't it? Got to touch of the sun, old boy.
Yeah.
Forgot to put your hat
Englishman. Yeah. Yes, it is, isn't it? Again, it's the echoes of Bertie Wooster, isn't it? It's very good, sir. You should put your hat on now, sir.
So that gets us into the second chapter where they're back on the schooner and Morley seems to be back in the present world. And he seems to go along with Thorway's suggestion that this was a touch of sun, a touch of delirium. And this sort of sends him back to thinking about his life and how he came to be in this place and in this situation. And we learn that really his driving desire as a young man was simply to get out of poverty. And he actually started on that upward path by becoming an importer of Oriental rugs. And one thing led to another, and he learns about the theory of the lost continent in the Pacific, which strongly appealed to him, and that became almost his obsession ever since. So he's put all his business funds and everything else into this trip to Easter Island.
Yeah.
Hired Thorway as the professional archaeologist, got a schooner manned by a Swedish crew, and set out on this strange trip.
Yeah, it's doubly interesting that he chose Thorway because Thorway's he says that he did not consider the Polynesian Isles a very fruitful field for research. The ruins were too old and fragmentary. The period to which they belonged was too conjectural and did not deeply engage his interest. Well, I guess it's like every sort of archaeologist, they have an era, don't they? Specifically.
Yeah, I guess same with historians in general, isn't it?
Yeah, of course.
They tend to specialise, and you think, what is it that attracts one to sort of ancient Rome and another one to the Tudors and that kind of thing? So there you could speculate, is it some ancestral memory or
there you go.
Something?
That's an interesting idea.
I wonder if we all feel that as well. I mean, is there a particular time and place that you feel a stronger attraction to?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
That old thing, if you could go back and be whatever, what would it be?
That's a very good point, isn't it? It's like Lovecraft always felt a pull towards, a generation before, didn't he?
Yeah,
even a couple of generations, maybe.
Almost, yeah, pre-Georgian, wasn't it? Really,
yeah.
The 18th century sort of gentleman kind of thing, I guess. Yeah, yeah. I see myself on a pirate ship personally, but
Yeah, yeah.
That's just because I look good in a big hat and boots.
I see myself poncing around with Byron and that lot, pontificating.
But strangely enough, again, what I like with Smith is the stories don't always go where you're expecting them to. No. At this stage, Morley thinks, oh, well, yeah, it was just a touch of the sun. Well, we've had a good look around. Perhaps it's time to finish the expedition and we're going to head back to port. Which Thorway is quite happy to hear because I think he's getting a bit fed up with all this.
Well, to be fair, his mate's acting like an excitable puppy, isn't he? He's kind of.
I like the language here as well. This is Thorway when Morley says we're going to finish the expedition. I agree, he rejoined. Also, if you will pardon me for saying it, I don't think the South Sea climate is one of ideal salubriousness. I've noticed occasional indispositions on your part for some time past, which is a very polite way of saying I think you're going a bit sort of mad.
Doolally tap, yeah.
But Morley agrees with him, really. And then the moon comes up.
Mm, yeah. Which aroused in Morley a vague but profound emotion, even as the ruins had done. It stirred among the shadows of his mind a million ghostly intimations, and the thrill he felt was at times not unalloyed with a cryptic awe and trepidation, akin perhaps to the primal fear of darkness itself.
And this is where we get that full transposition or transformation, where he goes from the present back into the past. As he gazes at the tropic plenilune, he feels that the orb is somehow larger and its light more brilliant. And he gets this sort of sensation of what's he doing on this strange vessel? Tonight is the night of sacrifice to Ralu, the Selenic goddess, and he, Matla, was to play an essential role in the ceremony. So he's got to get back to the temple.
Yes.
So he's gone fully back into this past life or this vision or whatever it is.
Yeah. He basically sets off, doesn't he, and starts climbing the palm-clustered hill above the shore, heading towards the temple. The air suffused with a primal, brooding warmth, with the scent of colossal flowers and ferns not known to modern botanists. So which is, I think, is a lovely touch. Again, he likes using flowers and scents, doesn't he, to purvey the uncanny.
We get that in a lot of these, don't we? It's either the prehistoric with your Hyperborea, or it's those jungles on Venus.
Yeah,
with these, everything's just a bit bigger and brighter and more vivid and gives off
fleshier.
More odor and fleshier.
Yes,
he
likes his fleshy blooms, doesn't he, Mr. Smith?
And this is where he is, right? He's perfectly at home in this. He can find his way to the temple very easily. He knows the names of the cities. He knows all about the opulent life of Mu, whose prosperity had of late years been menaced by Atlantean earthquakes and volcanic upheavals. So we've got that sense of the impending or approaching doom as well. And these were, it believed, owing to the wrath of Ralu, the goddess who controlled the planetary forces, and that's why all this human blood is going towards her, in order to placate the mysterious deity. But having said all that, his sole purpose now really is to get back to the temple, because the sacrifice has to be made in time.
Indeed. Yeah, you get that feeling of the stars are right, the moon is right, it's time.
And when he reaches the temple, it's not a ruin anymore, of course.
No.
And he just has a dim memory of visiting it in his future life or his other life.
Yeah.
And the priests, who were clad in lunar purple and yellow, received him in an impassive silence. And you may remember earlier he was getting glimpses of purple and yellow flashes. So that's obviously these people.
Yep.
One there was among them who carried a large shallow goblet of silver, but the seventh, whose hand would lift a long and curving knife of some copperish metal, had not yet arrived. So you speculate, well, is that Morley? Is he the seventh, or is it someone else?
Indeed, yeah. Yeah, so now we cut back to Thorway, don't we? Who'd been he'd found it curiously hard to apply himself to the half-written monograph of it on Etruscan tombs. And, in a state of steadily mounting irritation, he because he basically wanted the voyage to be over and to be back at home, no doubt with his dusty old books and his pipe. He basically throws a wobbler and goes on deck. And the moonlight dazzled him with its preternatural brilliance. And he didn't perceive for a few moments that the cane couch was empty. So he's gone up there and, no sign of Morley. So it wasn't just a trance in his head or anything like that. He has bodily, physically gone.
Yeah. Yeah, and there was just one little thing I wanted to point out here in in a Smithian vein, was as Morley or Matla is heading towards the temple, another thing he thinks is, why is he wearing these strange garments?
Yes.
So he starts to remove them, cast them aside one by one, because nakedness was ordained by sacerdotal law for the role he was to play. And then just a little bit after that, when it comes in, when he sees the priests, we get the line, his excitement rose. And I'm sorry, I
Uh,
know it's my
Genius.
mind, but
No, I did it myself.
that it's
Yeah,
Smith, right? That's got to
yeah.
be,
Oh, there's always a little bit of the risque somewhere. There's an undercurrent. Undercurrent is probably the best word for it, isn't it? With a lot of
yes,
Smith's work,
yeah,
you know,
yeah.
you get the impression that Nookie was never that far from his mind.
So Thorway is obviously following after Morley to try and find him, make sure he's all right. But the nearer he gets to the temple, his perception starts to change as well.
Mm.
He notices that the vegetation is changing and becoming these monstrous ferns and primordial looking flowers. And the closer he gets, the more he slips back into another personality as well.
I love that the fact we get this attempt at rationalization that we often see in weird tales. Um, yeah, is that surely it was some weird trick of the moonlight distorting the familiar palms and shrubs. You often get that, don't you? The rational man struggling in the face of all this weirdness to make sense of everything. I
Yeah,
think that's the core of a lot of these stories, isn't it? That rational mind trying to fathom what the hell's going on around them.
absolutely. And as we often get in these, the locals, whether they be rustics or indigenous or whatever they are, always sort of seen as the inverted commas lower orders,
Yeah.
always know what's going on. They
Oh
know
yeah.
so much more than these clever people.
Yeah, I think it should be a rule, right? One of those you should be taught at a very early age. If you go to some weird place and all the people that live there say don't go up there, there's probably very good reason. It's a house on the borderlands, isn't it? Don't
Yeah,
go to that weird
don't go up
house in
there.
the woods.
Yeah, don't go off the path.
Yeah, exactly.
No digging here.
Yeah, yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Yeah, so despite this struggle to maintain his rationality, suddenly he's not Thorway anymore, and he knows the real purpose for which he had come ashore, the solemn rite in which he was to play an awful but necessary part.
Mm.
The worshippers, the sacrifice, and the 6 fellow priests await his coming in the immemorial fane of Ralu. So, Thorway is the 7th priest they've all been waiting for, and is the one carrying the dagger, which makes it quite clear that poor
Yeah.
old Morley is to be the sacrifice.
Yeah. Which makes sense that he would strip naked, right? Because the priests are all in their purple finery, all the
Yeah.
rest of it. You don't generally get clothed sacrifices, do you? I mean,
Not in my
in these
experience, no.
no.
Screaming, maybe, but
Yeah. You tend to find that these ancient deities and gods and tentacular monstrosities like a bit of flesh on display when they're being worshipped. Do you know what I mean? So,
it is funny that now you mention
isn't
that
it?
when you think of every film, and it's always a young lady, isn't it, on the
Hammer,
altar?
in it. There's always
Yeah,
that scene where the bodice is pulled off.
yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
Mm.
It's it is what it is, I
Mm.
suppose. And then we get this paragraph that I think this is the paragraph that Wright actually liked,
Yes.
where we get the description of unassisted by any of the priests. So this is quite willing, it's quite a willing sacrifice. Matler had stretched himself on the cold altar. By the rustling stir and murmur of the throng, he knew that the 7th priest had arrived. All fear had left him. And we get this fairly graphic description of what it feels like to be
Mm.
sacrificed. It's quite again, Smith, as you say, when he does action, he doesn't pretty things up, does he? Really?
No, no. But I guess that's a poetic instinct of showing the beauty and the grotesquerie in equal measure. It's that
Mm.
poetic thing, isn't it, of showing everything in its reality.
Yeah,
You know.
yeah. And he kind of vaguely recognizes the priest with the knife, but is not really interested. He doesn't even try and remember it. He's already looking at the moon. And I like this. It seemed to him that the white moon was drawing nearer, was stooping from her celestial station to quaff the awaited sacrifice.
Nice.
And that's it. The knife is plunged down. We get the sudden darkness. And soon all things, even pain, were erased for Matler by the black mist of an eternal nothing.
Yeah.
So no afterlife. Is not going to paradise or Valhalla or anything else.
No.
Eternal nothing.
I love this third chapter. I mean, it's little more than like 3 paragraphs, but it's beautifully effective. Because in the morning you get Svensson and his sailors, and they're basically hanging around waiting for Thorway and Morley to return. So when they don't by the afternoon, Svensson decides it's time to investigate. So with one of his crew, he rows ashore, climbs the hill, and finds that the roofless temple was empty, save for the plants that had taken root in the crevices of its pavement. Svensson and the sailor, looking about for the archaeologists, were horrified from their stolidity by the stains of newly dried blood that lined the great groove in the altar block to its edge. Nice, isn't it? It's a great image. You can picture these chaps in their stripy sailor outfits. Yeah, standing around going, "Good Lord," If they were British, obviously, the Swedish equivalent of
Swedish equivalent. My word.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they get the rest of the crew ashore and they do a thorough search of the island. They question the locals who don't know anything, though they might have an idea. And basically, that's it. The two men have essentially disappeared into thin air. So Svensson and his men give up and presumably sail off. And the last line is, if they had been imaginative, it might have seemed to them that the archaeologists had vanished bodily into the past. That's interesting because although the blood remains as this sort of residue, they have physically gone back into that time and place.
Yeah.
You've got that idea of visions or of seeing it, but they've actually physically disappeared back into that time.
Yeah.
So maybe that's what Wright found unconvincing, that Thorwall, the stolid type, also fell prey to this memory or whatever it was.
But I think it's quite well handled because it's like a lot of those passages with Thorley when it's happening is his internal struggle of him trying to cling on to it. It mentioned several times, doesn't it, that he's trying to cling on to his sanity and put it out of his head. And he even says, like, am I going mad like Morley?
Yeah.
So it's still that rationalization. I think it's handled very well, personally.
Yeah, I don't see that that's any more unconvincing than any other weird story. I mean, it's funny in a way, isn't it? Now, with what we know about Venus, then those Venusian stories are more unconvincing because we know that nothing like that could survive on Venus.
Indeed,
so. Yeah.
Except the big Shogothy thing, because they can survive anywhere, right?
Absolutely. There's probably one in your basement even as we speak.
Indeed. That gurgling noise isn't the pipes.
That knocking on the door, go and investigate. No, don't.
Yeah.
Wait till the end of the show, then go and investigate. So I enjoy both of those stories. I think,
I did. Yeah, I really liked the Gorgon for some reason. I don't know why. I think it was because it was so visual. I was lying in bed reading it and I could just picture it. And like I said, I was picturing it as like one of those 1970s night gallery episodes, with the sort of the washed out colour palette and everything, I was picturing it in my head.
I can see it in black and white, that one, certainly.
Yeah, definitely.
And you can just see the old man. They would have got someone in to play him, like John Carradine or something like that,
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Well, that guy who always turned up in the Hammer horror films playing a grave digger. I can never remember his name, but it was always the same chap.
Well, not Michael Ripper, is it? You're thinking of?
Yes, Michael Ripper. There you go. The other one was Victor Madden, wasn't it? He was the other one.
Yes.
Because he had the old voice like that as well.
Now, speaking of cinema, that leads us very nicely and quite by chance because we're not professional enough to do real good segues, but that just happened to work out quite nicely. In our last episode, Rendezvous in Averoigne, we got talking about Lovecraft and the cinema, I remember.
Indeed.
And we were talking about Lovecraft had a job for a short time working at a cinema and speculated as to what films he might have seen and so on and so on. Well, we've had a lovely message in from our friend Mark Griffin of the 30 Plus Minutes with H.P. Lovecraft podcast. Hi, Mark. Thanks for writing in.
Hello, mate.
And Mark writes, hello. Lovecraft did discuss movies in letters to members of his circle. Charlie Chaplin was a favourite actor, and Lovecraft wrote a poem about him. Oh, I've never seen that. I didn't know that.
No, neither have I.
One of the movies a person would expect for Lovecraft to see was The Ghoul, starring Boris Karloff. Some of the scenes not at all bad in their visual effect and imaginative implications, he wrote to Clark Ashton Smith.
Yeah, and then he carries on. As for a better-known color film, Frankenstein, Lovecraft was disappointed. His reason was that it was nothing like the novel, which is, yeah, good point.
True.
The book has been altered beyond recognition, and everything is toned down to an insufferable cheapness and relative tameness. I fear the cinema is no place to get horror thrills, he wrote to Vernon Shea. Yeah, his disappointment with weird films as The Ghoul and Frankenstein soured him from pursuing other such movies. That's really interesting because, I mean, that's something we talked about when we've discussed things like the Guillermo del Toro and things like that.
Yeah.
Of a lot of these stories don't work as well visually.
Yeah, and I think for Lovecraft it was all about atmosphere, wasn't it? So if there's anything that spoils that atmosphere, then that's it. And I get the impression Lovecraft was very sort of binary in his views, very black and white.
Yeah.
I don't think he was that nuanced. It was either good or it was bad. You know,
yes. He wasn't the sort who would. Well, he didn't drink, did he? So he didn't have that thing of me. It was like, yeah, it's a 10-pinter. You know, I rate films on the pint scale of how many pints you have to enjoy it. You know, yeah, it's a full 10-pinter, that one. You know, the Call Girl of Cthulhu. That's a 10-pinter.
Oh yeah, I've not dared that yet.
It's hilarious. It's so bad, but yeah, have a couple of beers. Have a few beers, mate, and you'll love it.
And Mark then continues: if he could see the horror films made after his death, would his opinion have changed? In his letters, he spoke often of wanting to see the horror film Mad Love, starring Peter Lorre, which not less than 12 or 15 persons have independently recommended to me, he wrote. Back in his day, one couldn't simply stream a movie. One had to wait until it came to a nearby movie theatre, of course, yep. And if a person missed it during its normal week run, then more than likely a person would never see the movie ever. Without a doubt, Lovecraft's most favourite was Berkeley Square, a 1933 fantasy of a man who time travels to the 18th century and lives the life of an ancestor. Well, that ties.
That is not surprising at all, is
it? Yeah. And he wrote to Shear about that. Went to see Berkeley Square last night, having noted its presence in town. First cinema I've attended since Frank Belknap Long dragged me to one in Onset last July. And boy, was it some film? Absolutely. I haven't had such a kick in years. What atmosphere. My own 18th century absolutely come to life. Not a flaw. Architecture, landscape, costume, decoration, the whole thing. You can't realise the punch it gave me since all my life I've had the most oddest and inexplicable sense of personal membership in the 18th century and of being out of place anywhere else. He went to see that 4 times.
Blimey.
And apparently that's what inspired Shadow Out of Time.
I read that in the foreword to the Yith Cycle, the Chaosium Yith Cycle book. They mentioned I remember reading that at the time and thinking I should watch this movie, and I still haven't done it.
Yeah, I haven't either, I have to say, but I'll put that on the list again, because as Mark says there, nowadays you can stream pretty much anything.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Bit of digging. It's I've managed to find some right weird, some of the weird stuff that I've managed to find, like Polish adaptations of Ambrose Bierce and things like that.
You're like a sort of Lovecraftian film archaeologist.
I am, yes.
Or an archivist or something.
Yeah.
There's another little story seed. Yeah, and about the fact that Lovecraft worked in the cinema, this has been confirmed by one of Lovecraft's friends, Harry K. Brobst. Said he'd been briefly a ticket agent at a movie theatre in Providence, believed to be the one on 260 Westminster Street. It's gone through many names, but a lot of people love calling it the Empire Theatre, and that was demolished in the spring of 1948. And then, speaking of story seeds, Mark concludes by saying, surprisingly, no filmmaker has created a horror anthology where a ticket agent Lovecraft serves as the host. Since I'm announcing it here, I expect to receive a royalty check if the idea is ever used. Mark, absolutely. I think that's a wonderful idea.
It's a great idea.
Isn't it?
Lovecraft as the Crypt Keeper type,
Yeah.
Rod Serling type,
Because all of those sort of films had that, didn't they? Tales from the Crypt and
Oh
from
yeah,
Beyond the
yeah.
Grave. You have that character that joins all the films together, or even the Necronomicon.
I was just about to say the Necronomicon. Coombs' portrayal of Lovecraft, isn't it? It's
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, that's the closest I think that they've had. But yeah, all them things, anthology TV shows, they always had a host, didn't they?
Like the host, yeah,
it comes from Rod Serling, doesn't it? And
yeah.
Twilight Zone, Out of the Unknown, all this. You have to,
But even the old ones, the Boris Karloff, was it Thriller?
yeah, Thriller.
I think.
Yeah,
Obviously, Alfred Hitchcock will be the most
indeed.
well known to people.
Yeah,
And that then leads you into all that area, which was seemed to be a largely American phenomenon. I'm not sure if we had it in the UK at all. Maybe because over there they'd like cable TV and stuff. Of your horror hosts.
yes,
I suppose the modern one that people know is Elvira, who
yes,
introduced the
yeah.
films or whatever.
We had on late night Channel 4, and I can't remember the name of it, but it was something like Dr. Terrible or something. Yeah, they did a back-to-back on a Friday night in the 90s, sort of early to mid 90s. They did back-to-back horror movies, and they do one from the past and a current, but they had a theme. So you get like an old Hammer Dracula movie. And well, I remember you had Dracula AD 1970, and directly after it, you had Vamp.
Right.
And in the middle, you had this guy who's in the rubber mask, and he's all like, "Yeah, it's another kind of thing," And yeah, it was part of Four Later, and I think it was a Friday night. It was either a Friday or a Saturday night. I think it was the Friday because I think it was after Noisy Mothers, which was the heavy metal video show thing that they had on. Yeah.
I mean, you forget, I know there was some bad stuff on telly back then, but there was some bloody good stuff as well, wasn't there?
Oh man, I miss Four Later. Four Later was great because you had all that the sort of culture shows. You had things like Eurotrash and The Word and all that, and Beavis and Butthead, and then you'd get the horror movies like midnight. You'd get the midnight horror movie, and then after that, you'd get all the weird, arty, experimental stuff.
So that's a little sidetrack there, but nonetheless, it's a fascinating subject, and we can justify that by saying we were talking about that, and Lovecraft did talk to Smith about that as well. So
indeed, yeah, I think it's interesting stuff.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark, for sending that in. Really
cheers,
appreciate that. And of course, if you'd like to write in and correct our pronunciations or give us your thoughts on the stories we've covered, any ideas or suggestions, or indeed pick up things that we've missed, then please do get in touch. You can do so via our Facebook page, via Patreon, and of course you can drop us an email at innsmouthbookclub@outlook.com. And if you are on Patreon, then please do take a look at signing up. As I mentioned earlier, you can now subscribe to us on Buzzsprout at tier 1, which I think is called Acolyte. If you want to take the plunge and commit a little further, there are another 2 tiers as well, where you get even more benefits, and you also get a chance or an opportunity to come on the show. So you can join us as a guest, either on Strange Shadows or on the Innsmouth Book Club. So please do take a look at those. Thanks very much to all our existing patrons. I'd just like to say the summer copy of Innsmouth News has just gone out now, so that should be with you. And I'd also like to say a quick hello and thank you to our new YouTube subscribers as well, because we're picking up a lot of new members on the YouTube channel.
Oh, excellent.
So a quick thanks to Heather Poiret, R. Valentine, Phil on the Hill, and Death Wilson. That's
nice.
D-E-T-H. That's
Nice.
interesting. Nice. So thanks very much.
Cool. Yeah. And so, thank you for joining us on this episode. Join us again next time. Well, again, we'll be looking at 2 shortish stories. We'll be looking at The Kiss of Zoraida and The Face by the River. Another couple of stories that I haven't read. So this should be interesting.
Yep, looking forward to that. Thanks again for listening, folks. We'll see you next time. It's goodbye from me, Rob Hoyton.
And it's goodbye from me, Tim Mendes.